This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Welcome to the Hoco Palizzo Writing Life. My name is E. Ethelbert Miller, and my guest is Toi Derricotte. Toi Derricotte is the author of several collections of poetry. The most recent is The Undertakers Daughter, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Ms. Derricotte is also the author of the Black Notebooks. She has received numerous awards, among them fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. Ms. Derricotte is co-founder of Cave Canem and is a professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome, Toi.
Thank you.
You know, I went to your poem Gershwin, and you begin with the line, "It's a good thing to be friends with the dead." And I said, did being an undertaker's daughter give you a certain view on life?
Well, it's a funny line. I mean, when you say it like that, I get to look at it close up. And most people might not think it's a good idea to be friends with the dead. And I'm thinking of Ruth Stone saying, when her granddaughter said she was afraid of ghosts, Ruth Stone said, "I wish there were ghosts." You know, and I'm sure she was thinking her husband had died very tragically a few years before that. But yes, I mean, my grandparents lived above the funeral parlor, and I, at 3, 4, 5 years old, I worked in the funeral parlor, holding the door open for people that would come in and out to visit, answering the phone as I grew older. And a lot of times when other people, my family was upstairs having dinner or talking everything, I'd go down and pray for the dead. I had my own relationship. I would go down, I'd kneel on the kneelers, and I thought
Did you have any like nightmares?
Yeah, I did, actually. I remember thinking, you know, during the night, maybe somebody would come upstairs. And yet, I also had this compassion. I mean, I just thought, maybe if I knelt on those kneelers and my knees hurt, maybe I could make one of them come back to life. I mean, I obviously understood at 4, 5, 6 years old that when you die, you really die.
Right.
And it must have been a very scary thing for me.
Well, let's talk about Detroit, because when we look at, say, two African-American writers talking, many times the issue is about race. But when I look at your life growing up in Detroit, I think maybe the first thing that might be an impact might be issues of class and privilege.
Yes, that is true. And that was very hard to write about, because when I first started being aware of art, race was the foreground. I was friends with sculptors and other artists in the 50s and the 60s, and race was the foreground. But I knew I wanted to bring it up close and personal. And for me, gender was very important to write about, being a girl. And then in my own personal family, I was aware of these distinctions around class in particular, and how at one time I remember everybody in my family talked about living in one section of Detroit that was all everybody. You were a doctor, or you know, you worked in somebody's house. It didn't matter. And in fact, that was the very interesting thing about friends of our family. People came from all different kinds of class. If you worked in somebody's house, and let's say you worked in somebody's house who was very well-to-do, you might as well have been well-to-do yourself, because you knew everything about fine dining or china, or, I mean, these were the people who gave my mom her sense of what she should buy in terms of the finest china or an oriental rug, or, I mean, these were people who understood. So the classes blended, and yet there was a lot of understanding of the power behind class. And I discovered that at a very early age, too.
Were there any stories that you heard in your house growing up that laid the foundation for you becoming a writer?
I don't think so. I think that there was a lot about singing, and I think that I am singing more now as a writer.
So this is the Motown Toi Derricotte?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. It won't sound like
you
Motown.
You want to be the fourth supreme?
Oh God, you know, but at that time I wasn't aware of what it was to be in Motown. I mean, it was just like people lived around. Aretha Franklin lived down the street from me, right? And it was like, the only thing I cared about is what people were gossiping about Aretha and, you know, her boyfriends.
Right.
But, you know, now I go back and I listen to Motown and I'm realizing these people were geniuses beyond the beyond, you know, and I was growing up right in the middle of that. So, yes, I want to be a singer when I grow up.
Well, later on, as you move towards becoming a writer, and you've mentioned this in other interviews, Sylvia Plath's poem "Daddy" begins to sort of open a door. And I wonder if you could just read an excerpt from that. Okay.
Yeah, I took a class when I moved to New York, away from Detroit.
You're about 27 years old,
27. I had never showed my poems to anybody, or almost nobody, and walked into my first writing class, and I heard this poem, and I suddenly understood what I could do with my life.
So this poem was read by the teacher?
By the teacher, Pearl London. Daddy, you do not do anymore black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time, marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du.
Now, when you hear this poem, is it sound or content that's pulling you in?
Both. Both. I mean, I wasn't aware, when I was just a new fledgling writer, I wasn't aware about how I was hearing, because I was so used to hearing with sound that I didn't really know how much sound meant. It just was until I studied writing. Then I started understanding how much I knew. But content, I'd never heard anything. I'd never heard rage expressed and made beautiful.
Did you have that same rage at that time?
Oh yes, but I didn't know how it could be expressed. I knew how it could be expressed if somebody went crazy or killed himself or committed murder, but to take rage and turn it into something so perfectly controlled and so beautiful.
Let's talk about another beautiful poem. You also like the poem Southern Road by Sterling Brown.
I love
and that's another poem that when
sound,
you said
music,
sound again.
Music.
And I wonder if you could just read an excerpt of that.
Oh goodness.
And when did that poem come into your life?
You know, I still can't read it correctly. I think this came into my life when I was in D.C., when I was with you and start here in D.C. when we first met and started talking, and I started to be aware of Sterling Brown. Because what I have to say is that I never read a black writer in grade school, in high school, in college. I didn't know there were black poets, except Langston Hughes. But then when I started understanding Sterling Brown, and I was here in D.C., and I came across these poems, and they just blew my mind. And so I'll just do the last three stanzas you marked here. I like to try to do it like I hear it, but I don't know if I can do that. Double shackled, guard behind. Double shackled, guard behind. Ball and chain, baby, on my mind. White man tells me, damn your soul. White man tells me, damn your soul. Got no need, baby, to be told. Chain gang never, let me go. Chain man, never let me go. Po lost boy, baby, evermore.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned once how writers don't grow in solitude. And I would like you to explore the importance of silence, perhaps meditation and reading, and contrasting that with, you know, Kavikana, in which you have people having a sense of community. So,
Right.
you know, I'm just looking at how you balance the two.
Right, right, right. That's a hard question because I do most of my writing. I need to go to a library where there's no phone, and I do every day when I'm writing. Go at 9, bring my lunch, go to one of those little private rooms in the back. I got a lovely new modern library looking out over a field, and just sit there from 9 to 3. And that's privacy. But once you start writing, once you get into that frame, you know, you can be writing all night. You can be, it's always writing. And there is a kind of way I need to stay in touch with that little private room in me that has these strange things going on. I mean, it's much more coming from a place I don't know about than in a place I'm in charge of. But you do have to be in touch and know what to do when you get the message, you know. But at the same time, through Kavikanam, the first year of Kavikanam, what I saw was all these African-American poets who had never studied with another African-American poet, like me coming to D.C.,
Right.
never read another African-American poet, never had a teacher or a colleague, and here they were together, and they ate it up. It was food. To be together was food, spiritual and physical.
How do you
food.
feel that experience now? Because you go back and look at your own life, and I can look at my life. We didn't have that. Okay?
Right.
So now when we
Right.
look at all these
Right.
writers,
It's totally changed.
how's it going to change
You know
literature,
what? One of the ways it changes is that I think intellectual conversations that we didn't have maybe 3 times in our lives, you know, we got together with somebody to have. These people are having these conversations every day on the listserv. All 24 hours a day you can tune in and talk about who won the baseball game, who got the Nobel Prize, you know, and people are really saying what they really think. I mean, people get into pretty heavy conversations and people get upset with each other, but they keep listening and talking about these complex things. And this produces a kind of work which has these conversations worked out.
Well, let's look at something else that could happen. I listened to a young writer a couple of weeks ago, and they went through Kavikanam, and I said, wow, you know, I hear Cornelius Eady in them. Okay?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, for example,
In their poetry?
in their delivery,
In their delivery of their poetry.
and also even some of the things they're writing about. One would assume that after a while, if I came to, like, say, Kavikanam, and I look at you and I say, wow, I'm a young woman, I say, wow, I want to be like Toi Derricotte. I want to write like Toi Derricotte. I want to be like Cornelius Eady. I want to write like Cornelius Eady. That after a while, we would probably see something that hadn't existed in African-American literature. And that would be almost a thing of schools of writers, that someone has this particular sound, for good or bad. And I was wondering whether you're looking at that. Among people who come to Kavikanam.
Well, you know, one of the things that we've tried to do, and I think we've been pretty successful, and that is to invite faculty that represent all different kinds of writing, and to not only encourage it, but almost like Kavikanam wouldn't exist unless there was this interchange and this way of feeding on people who are unlike you. And I think a lot of times when you go to a graduate school, an MFA program, you sort of hook up to one teacher, and that's the one that you know, that's the one that you work toward. But I really do think that they are finding their own styles by,
well, let's talk about style.
by that
right.
mixing
Let's
up.
talk about style. And we're going to use you as a sort of like a little icon for me. Here's Toi Derricotte, right? Here's Tracy Smith, Nikki Finney, Harriet Mullen, Natasha Trethewey. What's the difference?
The world, and yet you can find so many connections, you know, so many connections, and yet I would say there's as much difference or more difference than
Okay,
any other writers in the country.
Then I'll ask this question. I'm your daughter growing up, and who do you recommend I read and why? Should I read Nikki Finney because she's going to help me become a young black woman? Is there something in Harriet Mullen that perhaps...
I don't answer that question.
Okay, then let me ask you this question. When we look at Toi Derricotte's work, okay, what do you see your readers taking away from it?
I think one of the things they could take away from it is to tell the truth. I mean, I really believe that in my generation, I don't know about this one or the next, that it was very important to uncover secrets and stuff that was buried. And that, that in those things, there was something that caused a release of power that only made the next work we would do more powerful. I really worked against certain kinds of repression that had happened. And it wasn't only white writers who were doing the repressing, it was black writers as well.
Well, are we at a point now where we could perhaps, using your work and others, talk about kinds of perhaps called black confessional literature?
Oh, certainly. And black experimental, and you know, you can talk about any kind of black writers now because of Cave Canem, I think, sort of putting that possibility, not to say those writers didn't exist before Cave Canem, but in some way it's mapped out in a way that's sort of under an umbrella or within a framework that that I think just shows what we've been able to do and what we have been doing, but wasn't quite in the mainstream. And now I feel it is more in the mainstream. It is visible in that way.
Well, one of the mainstream things I see you doing is writing prose poems and also creating, like in your last book, a combination of poetry alongside poetry. What makes a good prose poem?
Don't forget I'm singing.
I know. Well, we'll get to that later. But what makes a good prose poem?
Well,
and you've conducted workshops.
Yeah. I say, Ezra Pound said poetry has to be at least as good as prose. I say prose has to be at least as good as poetry. It's got to be really good to be what I want it to be. And to me, when I write prose, I'm really writing poetry. It's just that it may look to you like prose, but that's the form that I've found fits the function that I need it to serve.
Okay. Your first book was the Empress of the Deaf House.
Right.
And that's a Lotus Press book.
Right.
How did that manuscript come together?
Gee. That was my first manuscript, and all I can remember is sitting at a dining room table recording every poem over a period of about 4 years, maybe 100 times.
Did you know you had a book?
I don't think I did, but I did finally send it out. I sent it to Dudley Randall.
Okay, Broadside Press.
Who has my undergrads are using the Norton Anthology of poetry, and he has some fabulous poems in that book. But anyway, and Dudley Randall, I couldn't believe it, wrote me back to say he wasn't publishing anymore Broadside, but what I could consider Lotus Press with Naomi, and that's when I sent the manuscript out to this wonderful woman.
What kind of feedback did she give?
The poet laureate of
Detroit.
of Detroit.
Detroit, I think.
Yeah, and she just took so much time with my manuscript and talking to me about it. She didn't edit it. My books don't get edited very much. The Black Notebook's a little bit, but other than that, really, editors don't do much to my books, which I'm glad, because it's pretty finished when I'm finished.
Yeah.
But But when she put that book together, which is when they do linotype in those days, you know, letter by letter, she was in traction in the hospital from having an accident where her neck was broken. And she sat up in bed and put my book. I mean, you talk about a woman who has given her life to other poets. I mean, she's been so dedicated. If it wasn't for Naomi, I think she's published over 200 books.
Now, I noticed that you went from Naomi, your first book, then 5 years later, you did Natural Birth, and you published with the Crossing Press.
Right.
What encouraged you to seek another publisher?
Well, this was a different kind of book, and it looks more like prose. And I sent it to Toni Morrison. She was an editor at Random House. And she really liked that book. And she tried to get it published. But at that time, and this is what her communication to me said, that it looked like it looked like prose.
Okay.
And they couldn't sort of figure out where it went. Some of it looked like poetry and some of it looked like prose. And at those days, 1983,
it was difficult.
It was difficult to find a place for it. So
well, two people who liked the book.
So I knew the woman at Crossing Press, the editor, and she had expressed interest. And I said,
well, two people who liked the book, because you thanked them, is Marilyn Hacker and Sharon Oates.
Yeah.
Talk about what they saw in the book.
Oh, well, I was so brave, and I try to tell poets to be brave. Don't be foolishly brave, but take chances that are reasonable. I, for example, who was a complete unknown, wrote Marilyn Hacker and Sharon Oates, who were at that time they were producing a series of readings at Woman Books in New York, and I asked them, could I join them and in helping put together this series, and they said sure. So I thank them because of them I met writers like June Jordan and Adrienne Rich and the Gap-Toothed Girlfriends and Audre Lorde and so on.
You know, I want to ask you mentioned June Jordan, and I want to get your take on it. I look at all these women writers, and I mentioned them in this show. I don't see that many following in June Jordan's steps.
As political?
As political. And also in the Audre, where, you know, sometimes I mean, there was something fierce about Audre Lorde and June, okay?
Oh, yeah.
And when I look at some of the young writers, they don't seem to be on the forefront, you know? And I also look at Alice Walker today, who is still extremely active, you know, politically and writing. But I'm looking for that individual where, when I step outside of African American literature, I can look at someone like Suhair Hamad.
Right.
I say, well, Suhair is, you know, she's Palestinian, you know, she has an issue, and she brings a certain perspective to her work.
Right.
When I look at some of the writers now, I love their work, it's technically sound, but then it's something that, if it was like the old Soul Train, I wouldn't know if I would give it a high number in terms of other characteristics. And I was wondering if you saw that.
I think it's there. I hear it in Cave Canem. You know, as a matter of fact, there have only been a couple. All the poets at Cave Canem read. They all have their own little 4-minute reading.
Right.
And I've only seen a couple in 16 years. People stand up, ovation, and do like this and go down to the floor. And they are for
well,
those,
I want to do, because we have a few minutes, I want to stand up and do that too with your last book, The Undertaker's Daughter. This must have been a difficult book to write.
Oh, you're so right. I think I've been writing that book ever since I left home. But you don't just write a book, you live it, and it means you have to process what you're writing. You don't just write the words and okay.
But it seems as if some writers would never go down this path. I think you went past secrets, you went past a lot. I mean, I mean, how did this book change you? I'm
a totally different person. I mean, my life's been hell for 50 years. You know, no, I really mean, I've really taken on the process of writing, which means you don't just write, get up and go home and, you know, everything's the same. I mean, you are facing the trauma of memory and also telling the truth and also making a work of art takes a lot
but let me mention,
work.
You mentioned how you mentioned this in your book that for months your father and mother didn't speak.
Months.
Now, you are the writer coming out of the same family.
Yeah.
Who gives you the right to talk?
I love that. It's so beautiful. God, maybe. Because we're born. We're born. I mean, people tell us to stop. They knock us down. They give us our subject matter. Racism, abuse, your parents, your lovers, whatever. You get your subject matter. But underneath, you're born to speak. And I think that's what we're trying to get back to, that beauty and love and power that's innately
And I
there.
wonder if there's a little Billie Holiday in you, that you're a blues woman, that out of all this hurt, you make it into something beautiful. Is this are you going to be wearing a gardenia in your hair next time I see you?
You know, I'm going to go to the flower show and see if I can get one for tonight.
Okay,
I don't know where I would put it, but yes, Billie Holiday, she's in heaven, and she and I are going to sit and talk. I hope she likes me as much as I like her. I don't know. We never know about Billie Holiday.
Well, I'll tell you this, Joy. In closing, sitting down and talking with you is also comes close to heaven, too.
Thank you for having me.
This is Hoko Palitzo's The Writing Life. My name is E. Ethelbert Miller, and my guest has been Toi Derricotte.